My name is Sari van Poelje, and I'm an expert in business innovation and an expert in teaching people how to coach. I have a company called Intact Academy, where I teach people from beginner coach to team coach to organizational consultant to supervisor. And we have training programs all over the world. You can find us on www.intactacademy.com. I also run a company called Team Agility, where we help businesses innovate more quickly than their products so that they can be on time to market. You can find all the information on www.teamagility.com. We've started a series of videos to teach you what we do. And one of the tools we use is transactional analysis, or TA. We do these videos for you, but we also hope that you will share these videos because this will help your friends and families and colleagues understand where you're coming from and hopefully make the quality of life better. We were talking about conflicts in psychological games and how to get into conflict, but now we're also talking about how to get out of conflict. So we've talked about why do people get into games and how can you diminish the need for games. We've talked about the drama triangle and how to switch into the winner's triangle. But now we're going to talk about the game formula and all the exit doors we have to get out of games, even if you're into conflict already. It requires some discipline, but it is possible. So this work is based on the article by Stephen Karpman called Options, but also on my own experience of how to get people to get out of conflict. So in the game formula, if you look at the previous blogs, we've said one of the reasons people get into games is because they're under stress. Now, when you're under stress, everyone automatically goes back to their primary survival mode. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about script. So one really good way to stay out of games is to diminish your stress. And I always say delete, dilute, or diminish. So delete, dilute, or diminish means that when you're into stress, you can have various strategies to delete, dilute, or diminish. Now, delete means that you avoid your stress factor. So all of us have specific things that really get us stressed. Certain people that get us stressed, certain situations that get us stressed, certain triggers that remind us of our childhood that get us really stressed. One way, of course, to have less stress in your life is just to recognize, okay, I've got that. I'm going to make sure in my life I'm not in that situation anymore. So, for instance, for me, there's a certain type of person, I shouldn't really be saying this, but there's a certain type of person where I'm absolutely sure I'm going to get stressed. And these are people who persecute from victim position. So I know that. Nothing wrong with people who persecute from victim position. It's my thing. And it's something that reminds me of the past. So, when I meet these people, I have a trigger. I can recognize them at 50 pesos, as Bette Midler used to say. So I tend to avoid these people. Nothing wrong with them, but I know I'm going to get stressed. And when I get stressed, it's much easier for me to get into conflict. So 1, delete. 2, dilute. So if you meet a person like that and you can't avoid them at all, make sure you've got other people around. So, if you have to deal with these people, make sure you're in a group at least of people who have different kinds of energies where you don't have to deal with this alone. Dilute. Dilute the stress factor. The third thing is diminish. So one of the ways to diminish the trigger for stress when you meet this kind of person is to make sure you've got the internal resources going. So make sure your tank is full of recognition. Make sure that you have done your personal work, that you have cleaned your house internally so that this doesn't trigger you in the the amount that it used to trigger you. We call these people rubber bands. So it takes you back. It's like a rubber band, boom, it takes you right back to the situation that was. So if you work on your rubber bands, it will get you into conflict less easily. Okay? So secret number one to get out of conflict: delete, or diminish your stress factor. The other way, what I haven't mentioned, when you're under stress, it's a little bit in dilute, is that you up your support network. So if you have a support network around you, you will be less stressed and that therefore get less into conflict. Okay? The second thing is, any game or conflict starts, we said, with an exchange of ulterior transactions. So that means people say something, but they mean something else. And this meaning something else, the psychological message, will always win. Unfortunately, that's the rule of communication. So if I say to you, "Where did you put my socks this time, darling?" then the tone of what I say will be much more important than what I actually say. So that means you will react to my persecution in the tone, which is, keep your hands off my socks, or where the bleep did you leave my socks? You will not hear the question, which is, where did you leave my socks? Okay, so that's clear. This ulterior transaction, the psychological message, will win. One of the ways to deal with it, to stay out of conflict, is just to name it. So one of the ways is to say, "Am I understanding you correctly that you want to know where your socks are?" Or you could say, "Am I understanding you correctly that you want to fight about your socks? Because in that case, let's just put a clock to 5 minutes and have the fight." Sometimes you just need to relieve the stress. So one is dilute, diminish, or delete. The second way to get out of conflict when you're in it already is to name the psychological message, the ulterior. Yeah. And it's easy to do. You don't want to do it in every situation. I mean, if someone is trying to seduce you and they go, "Would you like to have a drink with me afterwards?" You're not going to go, "Am I understanding you correctly?" Because that would kind of be a killer about your romantic situation. But if people are hooking you into games, into something negative, it's a really handy trick to have up your sleeve. The third step in the game is really, in the game formula, I have to say, is that there's a switch. You respond to the ulterior, you get into one of the roles, and then you get a switch. There's an escalation of these ulteriors until you're hooked. That's the way conflicts work. And then suddenly, as I said last time, the monkey comes out of the sleeve. So you're having this conversation about who puts out the trash, and someone says, "If you really loved me, you would have put out the trash." And then you're having a conversation about your relationship instead of the trash. Actually, at the end of this conversation, the trash is still in the house. So you've done nothing with that, and you've had a really bad time replaying all the old moves in your relationship. The thing to do in a switch situation, because there's a switch and a cross up, is it's really interesting. So in every conflict, when there's a switch, it's like the center of the storm. There's a moment of silence where both of you are going, okay, one of you has switched we say ego states, or switched roles in the game. So you've gone, for instance, from rescuer to victim in this case, or from persecutor to victim. Where's the trash? Oh, if you really loved me. That's a switch from persecutor to victim. There's a moment of silence, because you can only continue the conversation when one of you changes ego states. The other has to change also to continue the conflict. But that moment of what happened here? We were talking about the trash, and now we're talking about the relationship. All of us have this. If you catch yourself in that moment, it's really important to have that presence to say, okay, I think we've had this conversation before, like 10 million times. You don't say that, obviously, but I think we've had this conversation before. Is it okay? I'm going to make a cup of tea. I love you. I'm going to come back in 10 minutes and let's talk about this. This moment of silence in any conflict is really your door towards something else. Yeah. And if you can catch yourself in that moment of silence, then you can step out. Very, very important skill to have when you're in conflict. There is always a moment when people are ready to escalate. And just before that moment, there's a moment of surprise that we call a switch or a cross-up. The last bit is way at the end of the game, there's a moment of payoff where you get into your favorite rotten feeling and you confirm your belief about self, others, and the world. Like in this trash situation, one person walks away and they go, I always have to do everything here. Nobody ever does anything for me and the world is a hard place, as an example. What you can do in that moment, and it's very difficult, this really takes a lot of discipline, is that you recognize that there's an opportunity for you to reconfirm your basic assumptions, but that you actually choose not to. This really requires discipline. So that you go, okay, I could go there, I'm choosing not to. That's why I often think, people talk about changing their stories, through therapy or whatever. That's great. But the actual change takes a lot of willingness to look at situations differently, but it takes a hell of a lot of discipline. It takes years, but it's really discipline, internal discipline. Yes, I could go there, but I'm not going to. The important thing to recognize is people get into conflict because there's an unmet need. Now, I know this is difficult to hold on to the moment you're in the heat of conflict or the heat of a psychological game. But actually, sometimes I'm in a game, even, I've been doing this for a very long time, for 35 years. Even I get into games still. And then I suddenly realize, oh no, I'm a trained professional. I should be a transactional analyst. I'm in a game now. I should get out. But I recognize that every time someone gets into a psychological game, including me, there's an unmet need. And one of the mega ways to get out of conflict or get out of games is to take a step back and to think, what is my unmet need in this, my unspoken need, and what is the other person's unspoken need? If you can get to that in some way, then that's a sure way to get out of conflict. There's a not so good story actually about one of my clients who every time he came in back from work got into a fight with his wife. So he'd been on a business trip, came home, got into a fight with his wife. Why are these shoes there? Why this? Why that? Yeah, so I had a talk with him, and it turned out, I heard him say, I deal with conflict every day. Why should I deal with the chaos when I come home? And I'm going, well, actually, the pattern is you come home, you have a fight, and then you have an excuse to go to your study and be by yourself. So what would happen if instead of having a fight, you tell your wife, every time I come home from a business trip, I need a moment for myself before I can re-engage in relationship? And he went, really? And yeah, why don't you just contract for it, And after that, they had a much more peaceful time. It's often in the transition times that people get into conflict. So that's the last trick to getting out of conflict, is to recognize that there's an unmet need. You heard, I'm happy. I'd be very, very happy if you use these tips to stay out of conflict.